and I didn't say a word. Not one. My brother thought I'd lost my mind. My sister-in-law pulled me aside at the reception and said, "You're just going to let her talk to you like that?" And I said yes. She looked at me like I'd grown a second head. That was the moment I realized how different I was from everyone else in that room. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I spent 32 years building something from nothing. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, in a house where the heat got turned off twice before I finished middle school. My father worked 2 jobs and still couldn't keep us ahead of the bills. I watched him come home exhausted every night, eat dinner in silence, and fall asleep in his recliner before the 10 o'clock news. I swore to myself that my kids would never know what it felt like to wear the same pair of sneakers for 2 school years in a row. I kept that promise. By the time my son, Garrett, was born, I was managing a mid-sized logistics company in Cincinnati. By the time he started high school, I owned it. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't Silicon Valley. It was trucks and contracts and early mornings and conference calls on Christmas Eve. But it was mine, and it gave my family a life I never had growing up. Garrett was a good kid. That's the thing people don't understand when I tell this story. He wasn't spoiled. He wasn't entitled. He did his homework. He played soccer. He mowed the neighbor's lawn for $20 every Saturday because I told him he had to earn his own spending money, even if I could afford to give it to him freely. I was strict about that. My wife Sandra used to say I took it too far sometimes. Maybe she was right, but I watched too many men in my industry give their kids everything and watched those kids become nothing. So Garrett turned out fine. Better than fine, honestly. He got into Ohio State on a partial academic scholarship, finished with honors in business, and went to work for a consulting firm in Chicago. I was proud of him. I am proud of him. That part of the story doesn't change. He met Nicolette his second year in Chicago. He called me on a Tuesday evening, which was unusual because Garrett was a Sunday afternoon caller, reliable as clockwork. I remember thinking something was wrong when I saw his name light up my phone on a Tuesday. But he wasn't calling with bad news. He was calling to tell me about a woman. He said, "Dad, I met somebody." I said, "Okay." He laughed. "That's it? Just okay? Tell me about her." And he did. She worked in marketing at a tech startup. She was from Connecticut. She had a dog named after a jazz musician, which I thought was a little affected but harmless enough. He said she was funny and sharp, and that she pushed back on him in ways that made him think harder. Those were good signs. Those were the things I'd told him to look for. I met Nicolette for the first time at Thanksgiving that year. She drove down with Garrett, and they arrived 2 hours late because of traffic on I-65, and she walked in holding a bottle of wine and a bakery box of cookies she'd special ordered from someplace in Chicago. She hugged Sandra immediately, which Sandra appreciated. She shook my hand, looked me in the eye, and said, "I've heard so much about you. I hope some of it was good." I liked her in that moment. That was my first mistake, deciding in the first 10 minutes. The dinner was fine. She was charming. She asked about the business, asked follow-up questions that were specific enough to show she'd actually listened to the answers, laughed at the right times. Sandra was won over immediately. I was more cautious, but that's my nature. I told Sandra that night before bed that she seemed solid. Over the next 2 years, I watched something shift. It was gradual. The kind of thing you notice in retrospect and wonder how you missed it in real time. Nicolette started making small comments about Garrett's job. Not critical exactly, more dismissive. "He's good enough to do so much more than this," she'd say, as if the firm he worked for was beneath him. Then she started making comments about our family's habits. We had a tradition of spending Christmas at Sandra's sister's house in Columbus. Low-key, potluck style, card games after dinner, kids running around in their pajamas. Nicolette came once and described it afterward as a little chaotic for the holidays. That word, chaotic, stuck in my throat. Then there was the money. I'll be direct about this because it matters. When Garrett and Nicolette got engaged, I offered to pay for the wedding. That's what I'd planned to do since he was a boy. I had a figure in mind, a generous figure. Sandra and I had talked about it for years. Garrett knew in a general way that we intended to contribute significantly. What I didn't anticipate was Nicolette's family's expectations. Her parents, her father specifically, had opinions about what the wedding should look like. They wanted a venue in Connecticut near their family. 250 guests at a minimum. A specific catering company that her mother had used for events for years. A photographer from New York whose starting rate was more than I'd paid for my first truck. These weren't requests, exactly. They were just the assumed baseline. The floor. I sat down with Garrett and told him what I was willing to contribute. He looked at the number and said it was more than enough. Then he went home, and I assume he had a conversation with Nicolette, because 3 days later he called me back and said the number might need to stretch a little. I asked him by how much. The answer was nearly double what I'd offered. I said no. Not aggressively, not angrily. I just said, "That's not what I had in mind, son." I told him we could have a beautiful wedding with my original budget if they made different choices. I told him the venue in Ohio I had in mind, told him about the caterer Sandra and I had talked to, told him there were photographers in the Midwest doing extraordinary work for a fraction of what they were quoting. He said he'd talk to Nicolette. I never heard back about it directly. What I heard 3 weeks later was that Nicolette's father was covering the difference. And Garrett said it with a kind of relief that I found, if I'm honest, a little troubling. I told Sandra that night that I didn't have a good feeling about it. She told me I was reading into things. I let it go. The wedding was held in Greenwich, Connecticut, on a Saturday in September. The venue was a restored estate on 5 acres. The flowers alone probably cost more than my first car. It was genuinely beautiful. I won't take that away from anyone. Sandra wore a dress she'd bought months earlier, pale blue, and she looked the way she always looks, like the most sensible and elegant person in any room she enters. I wore a charcoal suit and a tie my daughter had given me for Father's Day. We drove up the day before and stayed at a hotel nearby. Garrett called that evening and said dinner was a family thing at Nicolette's parents' house and that we should come. We did. It was a large colonial home, immaculate, the kind of house that has a name. There were catered appetizers in the living room, and jazz playing softly from hidden speakers. Nicolette's father, a tall man with a firm handshake named Stuart, was pleasant enough toward me. Her mother, Cecilia, was warm to Sandra. I thought maybe I'd been wrong about all of it. The ceremony the next day was elegant and brief. Garrett cried a little at the altar, which surprised me and made me proud in a way I didn't expect. Sandra held my hand through the vows. The reception is where everything changed. The cocktail hour went smoothly. We were introduced to people I'd never meet again, smiled until my face ached, told the story of my business 4 times in a row because it was the easiest thing to talk about. Sandra was gracious and warm and kept finding me across the room with her eyes in that way. She's done for 34 years, the way that says, "You doing okay?" I was doing okay. The toasts were what I was dreading, a little. Public speaking at emotional events has never been my strength. I had something prepared, short, sincere, nothing fancy. Garrett had asked me to say a few words. I thought it would happen right after dinner. Instead, during the toasts, something changed in the order of events that no one told us about. The best man went first, then Nicolette's maid of honor. Then Stuart gave a long and somewhat self-congratulatory speech about his daughter that clocked in at nearly 12 minutes. I watched Garrett smile politely through all of it. Then the MC announced a special presentation that Nicolette had apparently put together, a slideshow of her and Garrett's relationship, set to music. 5 minutes of photographs from their trips to Europe, their apartment, their dog, weekend getaways to places I'd never heard of. It was lovely. There was one photograph of Garrett as a child in it, from some picture she must have gotten from somewhere. And for a moment I felt something that almost embarrassed me. A kind of unexpected longing for when he was small and the world was simpler. There was not a single photograph of Sandra in that slideshow. Not one, I noticed. Sandra noticed. We didn't say anything to each other about it in the moment, but I saw her face go carefully neutral the way it does when she's choosing not to react. After the slideshow, Garrett stood up to thank everyone. He went through the list. He thanked the venue. He thanked the catering staff. He thanked Stuart and Cecilia for their incredible generosity. He thanked his groomsmen by name. He mentioned his grandmother, who had passed 2 years earlier. He thanked his college friends. He thanked the dog. He said, "And of course, thanks to my parents for making the trip." That was it, making the trip, like we'd driven across town for a barbecue. Sandra's hand found mine under the table. I squeezed it and said nothing. An hour later, I was standing near the bar getting a glass of water. I don't drink much, never have. When Nicolette appeared next to me, not by accident. I could tell by the way she moved, deliberate, chin up, the expression of someone who has decided to do something and is doing it before they can talk themselves out of it. She said, "I need to talk to you." I turned and looked at her. She was still in her wedding dress, and she was beautiful in it. I'll give her that. She said, I know you didn't want to pay for this wedding the way we needed it to be paid for. And I know you think you had some say in what this looked like. I just want to be very clear." She stopped, and then she said it. "You don't. This is our life. And if you're going to be difficult about things going forward, I'd rather you just stay out of it entirely. Nobody asked for your opinion and nobody needs it." I looked at her for a long moment. I said, "Enjoy your night, Nicolette." And I walked back to the table. I didn't tell Sandra what had just happened. Not right then. I sat back down and finished my water and watched my son dance with his new wife. And I made a decision so quietly that it didn't even feel like a decision. It felt like something that had already been made, somewhere behind my chest, in the part of you that just knows. My brother found me at the end of the night near the coat check and asked if I was all right. I said I was fine. He said, "You've been quiet." I told him I was tired. He didn't believe me, but he let it go. On the drive back to the hotel, Sandra said, "Something happened." It wasn't a question, I told her, all of it exactly as it had happened. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I love about her. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "Nothing, for now." She didn't ask me to explain, she just nodded. That was the night I started paying attention differently. In the months after the wedding, Garrett called the way he always had. Sundays mostly, but the calls got shorter. When I asked about his week, the answers were vague. When Sandra asked about plans to visit, there was always something in the way. Work was busy, they had plans. Nicolette's parents were in town. I noticed that every story Garrett told now started with Nicolette's opinion. "Nicolette thinks we should look at buying on the north side." "Nicolette said the restaurant you recommended wasn't really her thing." "Nicolette feels like we've been spending a lot of time traveling for other people's events." I didn't comment on these things. I asked about his work. I asked if he was happy. He always said yes. About 8 months after the wedding, Garrett called me on a Wednesday, again, unusual, and told me he was thinking about leaving the consulting firm. He had an idea for a business, something in supply chain tech, and he wanted to know what I thought. We talked for 2 hours. It was the best conversation we'd had in a year. He was sharp and clear-eyed and had clearly thought it through. I told him what I told him honestly. The idea was good, but the timing and capitalization needed work. I gave him specific things to think about. He took notes. At the end, he said, "Dad, would you consider being involved? Even as an advisor?" I said yes. Of course I said yes. 2 weeks later, he called back and said he'd decided to bring in a different advisor. Someone Nicolette's father knew. A contact from Stewart's network. He said, "I just think it makes sense to keep things a little separate, you know?" I said I understood. I didn't call him the following Sunday. He didn't call me either. Sandra texted him and got a short reply. This went on. What I did in the meantime was what I have always done when something is wrong that I cannot immediately fix. I worked, I focused on my business. I had a strong quarter, then another. I brought on 2 new clients, a regional grocery chain and a manufacturing operation out of Indiana, that pushed my revenue to a level I hadn't seen since before the pandemic. I exercised in the mornings. I took Sandra to see her sister in Columbus for a long weekend. I fixed the fence in the backyard that had been leaning for 3 years. I did not reach out to Nicolette. I did not raise the conversation with Garrett. I said nothing, but I did something that I'd been meaning to do for years. Something I'd put off because it felt morbid, and I kept telling myself there was time. I called my attorney and I rewrote my estate plan. This is the part of the story that people think is about revenge. It isn't, or at least that wasn't what it felt like at the time. What it felt like was clarity. For the first time in a long time, I was being honest with myself about what I was building and for whom. I had spent 32 years building something that I intended to pass on to people who would value it. My estate plan had been written when Garrett was 23, and the world looked different. I spent 3 months working through it with my attorney, a careful, methodical woman named Davis, who asked excellent questions, and never once told me what she thought I should feel about any of it. We restructured everything. The business, the real estate holdings, the investments. A trust was established. The terms were specific and tied to participation and relationship, not just bloodline. It was not punitive, it was realistic. I didn't tell Garrett, not because I was hiding it from him, because it wasn't his information yet. It was mine. 14 months after the wedding, I got a call on a Thursday afternoon. It was Garrett. He sounded different, quieter, flatter, the way he'd sounded the time he called me from the hospital after a car accident in college. Not panicked, just stripped down. He said, "Dad, can I come home this weekend?" I said, "Of course." He drove down alone, arrived Saturday morning. Sandra made breakfast, the way she does when she's worried about someone. Eggs, toast, the good orange juice, the whole thing laid out on the kitchen table like a small act of care. Garrett sat down and didn't eat much. After breakfast, Sandra found something to do in the other room. Garrett and I sat at that kitchen table for 4 hours. He told me that things had been hard, that he and Nicolette had been fighting in a way they hadn't before, that he felt like he'd been losing himself, piece by piece, and he hadn't noticed until he was already pretty far in. He told me about the advisor, Stuart's contact, who had talked him out of his best ideas and run through more of his savings than he'd wanted to admit. He told me that Nicolette didn't understand why that bothered him. He said, "I keep thinking about what you told me when I was in high school, about the foundation." I remembered. He'd been having trouble with a friend group that was making bad decisions. I'd told him that the foundation was the only thing that mattered, that you could build anything on solid ground, but nothing held on sand. He said, "I think I built something on sand, Dad." I didn't say anything for a moment, then I said, "So what are you going to do about it?" He looked at me. "I don't know yet." I said, "That's an honest answer. Start there." He stayed through Sunday. Sandra took him grocery shopping at one point, which I think was less about groceries and more about getting him out of the house for an hour and talking to him in the way that only she knows how. When they came back, he seemed lighter, not fixed, but lighter. He hugged me before he drove back to Chicago. A real hug, the kind he hadn't given me since he was maybe 15. He said, "I should have called sooner," I said. "You called when you were ready." After he left, Sandra stood in the kitchen and looked at me. She said, "He's going to be okay." I said, "I know." She said, "Are you okay?" I thought about the wedding, the slideshow with no pictures of her, the table, the handshake from Garrett, stiff in public, the way you'd thank a colleague, Nicolette's voice near the bar, certain and unkind, the months of short calls and vague answers, the advisor and the business idea and the savings. I said, "Yeah, I'm okay." And I meant it, because of what I knew that no one else in that kitchen knew yet. 6 weeks after Garrett's visit, I sat him down over lunch at a steakhouse in Cincinnati. Somewhere neutral, somewhere that felt appropriate for the kind of conversation we were about to have. He'd driven down for it. He thought we were just having lunch. I brought a folder. Inside was a summary of the trust, prepared by my attorney. Not the full legal documents, just a clear, readable summary of how things were structured, what the terms were, and why. He read it slowly. I watched his face move through several different expressions. When he was done, he set it down carefully. He said, "You did this after the wedding." I said, "Yes." He was quiet. Then he said, "This isn't what I expected." I said, "I know it's a lot to take in." He said, "It's not punitive." "No," I said, "it's not." The trust didn't cut him out. It didn't punish him. What it did was establish that the business, the 32 years I'd built, would transfer to a management structure that included him only if he was actively involved in a meaningful way. Not nominally, not as a name on a document. The way his grandfather was involved in the only thing that mattered to him, which was his family. The way I had been involved. Fully with both hands, not because he had to be, but because he chose to be. There was a clause about the advisory relationship. There was a clause about what happened if he chose a path that prioritized someone else's family's network over his own judgment. He sat with all of it for a long time. Then he said, "I need to make some decisions." I said, "Take your time." He looked up at me. "Why didn't you tell me you were doing this?" I said, "Because you weren't asking me anything that required an answer yet." He thought about that. He nodded slowly. We ate our steaks. We talked about football. We talked about the grocery chain client I'd landed, and whether Garrett thought there was a tech angle worth exploring. It was the easiest meal we'd had in 2 years. Walking out to the parking lot, he stopped and said, "She told you to stay out of it. At the wedding." I said yes. He said, "You didn't." I said, "I stayed out of everything that wasn't mine to be in. I was never in her life or her choices. But this," I gestured vaguely at the general direction of everything. "This is mine. I don't stay out of what I built." He stood there in the October cold, hands in his jacket pockets. He said, "I hear you, Dad. That was enough. That was more than enough." The months after that moved differently. Garrett and Nicolette entered couples counseling. He told me that matter-of-factly, without drama, like reporting a practical decision he'd made. I didn't ask questions. I told him I thought it was a good idea and left it at that. His Sunday calls came back, and they were longer. He started asking for my opinion on things again. slowly, carefully, like someone learning to use a muscle they'd ignored. Sandra sent Nicolette a card around the holidays. A simple one, nothing loaded, just a card. I don't know if she responded. I don't spend much time thinking about Nicolette, honestly. What I think about is what Garrett said at that kitchen table. About the foundation. About noticing too late that something was wrong. I know what it costs to rebuild a foundation. I've done it. I know that it's slow, and that there are no shortcuts, and that most people, when they stand at the beginning of that kind of work, want to look away, because the scope of it's frightening. But Garrett doesn't look away from hard things. That's something I taught him, even when I thought he'd forgotten it. Last spring, he drove down on a Saturday without telling me ahead of time. He knocked on the back door, the one that goes into the kitchen, the one that only family uses, and when I opened it, he said, "You got a few hours?" I said, "What do you need?" He said, "I want to talk about the supply chain idea, the real version. No outside advisors." I told him to come inside. Sandra was already pulling out the good coffee. We sat at that kitchen table for most of the afternoon, and he laid out a plan that was better, sharper and more grounded than anything he'd shown me 2 years before. And I leaned forward with both elbows on the table, the way my father used to when he was paying attention to something that mattered. And I listened to every word. That's where we are now. Taking it one step at a time, the way anything worth building gets built. I didn't say anything dramatic at the wedding. I didn't make a scene. I didn't call anyone out. I drove home that night in September, and I worked, and I waited, and I paid attention, and I made decisions about my own life that were mine to make. Sometimes the quietest thing you can do is also the most powerful. My brother still thinks I'm a little too calm about all of it. He asked me recently if I ever got angry. I told him I got angry plenty. I just didn't let it make the decisions for me.